The cafeteria fell silent as 12 uniformed soldiers marched through the doors of Jefferson High School. Their polished boots echoed against the linoleum as they approached my table, where I sat alone with my crutches propped against the wall. The lead officer, his chest decorated with ribbons, stopped directly in front of me and saluted sharply. "Sir, your orders?" Every student who had mocked me that morning now stared in stunned disbelief. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Wheeler, and I've been walking with crutches since I was 8 years old. A rare bone condition called fibrous dysplasia had weakened my left leg, requiring multiple surgeries and leaving me permanently dependent on mobility aids. By the time I entered my senior year at Jefferson High in Portland, Oregon, I thought I'd grown immune to the stares and whispers that followed me down every hallway. I was wrong. September 3rd marked my first day at Jefferson after transferring from my private school across town. My family had moved to a smaller apartment following my father's job loss, making the expensive tuition impossible to maintain. The transition felt like stepping into a different world, one where I didn't have the protective bubble of teachers who knew my story and classmates who'd grown accustomed to my presence. The morning started innocuously enough. I navigated the crowded hallways, locating my locker and finding my first period chemistry class without incident. Mrs. Patterson seemed kind, offering me a seat near the front where I could easily prop my crutches against the lab table. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe this transition might be smoother than anticipated. That optimism shattered during lunch. The cafeteria buzzed with the typical chaos of 1,700 students cramming into 30 minutes of freedom. I collected my tray, turkey sandwich, apple, chocolate milk, and scanned the room for an empty table. Most surfaces overflowed with established friend groups, their territorial boundaries clearly marked by backpacks and jackets. I spotted an empty table near the windows and began making my way across the room, balancing my tray while maneuvering, my crutches through the maze of chairs and scattered belongings. The aluminum crutches clicked rhythmically against the floor, a sound that seemed to announce my presence to everyone within earshot. That's when I heard the first snicker. "Check out the new kid," someone whispered loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Looks like he's got training wheels for his legs." The comment came from a table occupied by what I quickly identified as the school's athletic elite. Letter jackets, perfectly styled hair, and the casual arrogance that comes with being 17 and conventionally successful. Their leader appeared to be a broad-shouldered guy with sandy brown hair and a face that probably earned him plenty of attention from his female classmates. I continued toward my chosen table, hoping to ignore the commentary, but the voices grew bolder. "Hey, Crutch boy!" the sandy-haired athlete called out. "You trying out for the track team?" His friends erupted in laughter, the sound sharp and cruel in a way that only teenage mockery can achieve. I kept walking, my face burning with embarrassment, but my tormentors weren't finished. "Maybe we should get you some racing stripes for those things," another voice added. "Help you go faster to your special needs classes." I reached my table and carefully set down my tray, propping my crutches against the wall with practiced efficiency. The jeering continued behind me, each comment designed to cut deeper than the last. "I bet he gets to park in the handicapped spots," someone said. "Probably has one of those hanging mirror tags, too. Wonder if his crutches come with training wheels like a little kid's bike. Maybe we should ask the nurse if she's got any spare. Wheelchairs. Upgrade his equipment." The laughter grew louder, attracting attention from surrounding tables. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me as I unwrapped my sandwich with trembling hands. The bread tasted like cardboard, but I forced myself to chew and swallow, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flee. My tormentor, who I later learned was named Blake Morrison, starting quarterback and son of a prominent, local businessman, stood up from his table and began walking toward me. His entourage followed like eager disciples, their excitement palpable as they sensed an opportunity for live entertainment. "Hey there, Stumpy," Blake said, positioning himself directly across from where I sat. "I'm Blake Morrison. You probably heard of me. I'm kind of a big deal around here." I looked up at him, meeting his gaze steadily despite the humiliation coursing through my veins. "Marcus Wheeler," I replied quietly. "Marcus Wheeler," Blake repeated, as if testing how my name tasted in his mouth. "Well, Marcus Wheeler, I've got to ask, what's the deal with the lumber? You building a treehouse or something?" His friends howled with laughter at this display of wit. One of them, a lanky kid with acne scars and mean eyes, chimed in, "Maybe he's collecting firewood. For winter." "Or maybe," Blake continued, warming to his theme, "maybe he's practicing to be a pirate, peg leg and everything. Ahoy there, matey." The entire cafeteria seemed to be watching now. I could feel the weight of their collective attention pressing down on me like a physical force. Some faces showed amusement, others displayed the uncomfortable fascination people feel when witnessing someone else's humiliation. A few students looked genuinely sympathetic, but none moved to intervene. I took another bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly and deliberately. My silence seemed to frustrate Blake, who apparently expected a more dramatic reaction to fuel his performance. "You know what I think?" Blake said, leaning forward and placing his hands on my table. "I think you're faking it. I bet you can walk just fine when nobody's looking. This whole cripple act is just to get attention and special treatment." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. In my previous school, everyone knew about my condition. Teachers and administrators had worked with my family to ensure I received appropriate accommodations without making me feel like a burden or spectacle. Here, I was starting from scratch, and Blake's casual cruelty reminded me just how vulnerable that made me. "I'm not faking anything," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Prove it then," Blake challenged. "Show us your medical records. Or better yet, try walking without those sticks. I bet you can't even stand up straight." The crowd around us had grown larger, forming a loose circle that trapped me at the center of their attention. I could hear whispered conversations and muffled laughter as students pulled out phones to capture what they clearly expected to be an entertaining confrontation. I stood up slowly, using my crutches for support, as I always did. The movement was practiced and efficient, but Blake seized on it immediately. "See?" he announced to his audience. "He's using them like a crutch." The pun earned another round of laughter, and I realized that Blake was playing to the crowd now, his initial cruelty evolving into a full-scale performance designed to cement his social status at my expense. "Come on, Marcus," Blake taunted. "Just take 5 steps without those things. 5 little steps. If you can do that, I'll leave you alone." I knew it was a trap. My condition made unassisted walking extremely difficult and painful, but more importantly, I had nothing to prove to Blake Morrison or anyone else in that cafeteria. My disability wasn't a character flaw or personal failing. It was simply a fact of my existence, as immutable as my eye color or height. But I also knew that backing down would mark me as easy prey for the remainder of my senior year. "No," I said simply. Blake's eyes lit up with triumph. "No? You mean you can't do it? You really are a cripple." The word hung in the air like a slap. Around us, the crowd grew restless, sensing that the entertainment was reaching its climax. I could see phones recording, capturing my humiliation for posterity and social media distribution. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I looked Blake Morrison directly in the eye and said, "You're right. I am disabled. I use crutches because I need them, not because I want attention or special treatment. If that makes you feel superior, then congratulations. You've successfully mocked someone for having a medical condition they didn't choose and can't change." The cafeteria fell silent. Blake's smirk faltered slightly, perhaps recognizing that my response hadn't gone according to his script. "But here's what you don't understand," I continued. my voice growing stronger with each word. Every morning, I wake up and face challenges you can't imagine. Every day I push through pain and limitations that would probably make you quit before lunch. So if you think my crutches make me weak, you're welcome to that opinion. But you're wrong. Blake recovered, quickly, his cruel smile returning full force. "Oh, we've got a tough guy here," he announced to the crowd. "The gimp thinks he's some kind of hero." That's when the cafeteria doors burst open, and 12 figures in crisp military uniforms marched into the room with precision that made every head turn in their direction. The 12 uniformed figures moved through the cafeteria with military precision that commanded immediate attention. Their polished black boots struck the linoleum in perfect synchronization, creating a rhythmic cadence that silenced every conversation in the room. Students scrambled to move chairs and backpacks out of their path as they advanced directly toward the center of the cafeteria where Blake Morrison stood frozen in confusion. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The lead officer wore the crisp white uniform of the U.S. Navy, his chest adorned with ribbons and medals that spoke of years of distinguished service. His weathered face bore the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command, and his steel-gray eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency before settling on me. Captain James Harrison came to a halt 3 feet from our table, his men forming a precise formation behind him. Blake and his friends stumbled backward, their earlier bravado evaporating like steam in the face of this unexpected military presence. "Marcus Wheeler?" Captain Harrison's voice carried the authority of decades spent giving orders on naval vessels around the globe. "Yes, sir," I replied, struggling to process what was happening. The captain's weathered hand moved to his forehead in a sharp salute. Behind him, 11 other uniformed personnel, a mix of Navy, Marine, and Coast Guard officers, followed suit in perfect unison. "Sir, your orders?" Captain Harrison asked, his voice carrying across the now silent cafeteria. The question hung in the air like something from a dream. Every student in the room stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to bewilderment. Blake Morrison's mouth hung open, his face pale with confusion. The phones that had been recording my humiliation moments earlier now captured something entirely different. I stared at Captain Harrison, my mind racing to make sense of this surreal moment. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think there's been some mistake. I'm just a high school student." The captain's expression softened slightly, though his military bearing remained impeccable. "No mistake, son. We're here on behalf of Admiral Rebecca Wheeler, United States Pacific Fleet. She sends her regards and wanted to ensure you were settling in well at your new school." The name hit me like a thunderbolt. Admiral Rebecca Wheeler, my Aunt Becca, my father's older sister whom I hadn't seen in over 3 years. The brilliant naval officer who had risen through the ranks to become one of the youngest admirals in recent Navy history. The same aunt who had sent birthday cards from aircraft carriers and Christmas presents from ports around the Pacific Rim. "Aunt, Becca sent you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Admiral Wheeler received word that you might be experiencing some social difficulties at your new educational facility," Captain Harrison replied diplomatically. "She wanted to personally ensure that you understand the full support of the United States Navy remains at your disposal." Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Rodriguez stepped forward, her marine dress blues immaculate despite the unusual setting. "The Admiral also wanted us to remind you, sir, that courage isn't measured by the strength of one's legs, but by the strength of one's character." The word struck me with unexpected force. I remembered now, 3 summers ago at a family reunion, before her latest deployment, Aunt Becca had used almost identical phrasing when discussing her own rise through the military hierarchy as one of the few women in her field. Blake Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. What is this? What's going on here?" Captain Harrison's attention shifted to Blake with the slow, deliberate movement of a battleship's main guns tracking a target. "And you are?" "Blake Morrison," the quarterback stammered. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mr. Morrison," the captain said, his tone carrying the chill of Arctic waters. "Am I to understand that you've been providing Mr. Wheeler with commentary regarding his medical equipment?" The formal phrasing made Blake's earlier taunts sound even more petty and cruel in comparison. Around us, students shifted uncomfortably as the weight of adult authority settled over the situation, like fog rolling in from the ocean. "We were just joking around," Blake mumbled, looking desperately for support from his friends who had suddenly found their shoes intensely interesting. "Joking," Captain Harrison repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison, what branch of service are you planning to enter after graduation?" The question caught Blake off guard. "Branch of service? I'm going to state on a football scholarship." "Football," the captain mused. "Physical, prowess, team coordination, strategic thinking under pressure." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably. "Tell me, son, have you ever considered what real courage looks like?" Blake's face flushed red, but he remained silent. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward again, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had served in combat zones. "Real courage, Mr. Morrison, is facing challenges that most people can't imagine, every single day, without complaint or self-pity. Real courage is adapting to circumstances beyond your control and still pushing forward to achieve your goals." The captain nodded approvingly. "Mr. Wheeler here demonstrates more courage getting out of bed each morning than most people show in a lifetime. His aunt, Admiral Wheeler, has personally led naval operations in the South China Sea, commanded vessels with crews of over 500 personnel, and earned the respect of everyone who has served under her command." I felt tears threatening to spill over, but they weren't tears of humiliation anymore. The overwhelming support from these uniformed strangers, sent by an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, created a warmth in my chest that pushed back against the cold embarrassment of the morning's events. "Furthermore," Captain Harrison continued, his gaze never leaving Blake's face, "Admiral Wheeler wanted me to convey that Mr. Wheeler's determination to succeed academically, despite the additional challenges he faces, represents exactly the kind of perseverance and dedication the military values in its finest officers." The captain reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "She also wanted me to present you with this, Mr. Wheeler." I accepted the box with trembling hands, noting its weight and the smoothness of its polished surface. Inside, nestled in dark blue velvet, lay a set of naval insignia, the eagles and anchors of a commissioned officer. "These belong to your grandfather, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Wheeler, who served with distinction in the Pacific Theater during World War II," Captain Harrison explained. "Admiral Wheeler felt it was time they were returned to the family." Revelation struck me speechless. My grandfather had died before I was born, and family stories about his military service had always been vague and reverent. I'd never known the specifics of his rank or service record. Lieutenant Rodriguez handed me an envelope bearing the official seal of the Pacific Fleet. "The Admiral also wanted you to have this." With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded a letter written on official Navy letterhead. Aunt Becca's familiar handwriting filled the page with words of encouragement, family history I'd never known, and an invitation to visit her at Pearl Harbor during my spring break. But it was the final paragraph that made the biggest impact. "Marcus, never forget that our family has always produced individuals who face adversity with dignity and grace. Your courage in dealing with your medical challenges makes me prouder than any medal or promotion I've ever received. The ocean teaches us that true strength comes not from avoiding storms, but from learning to navigate through them with skill and determination." The cafeteria remained absolutely silent as I finished reading. When I looked up, every face in the room wore a different expression than when this encounter had begun. Where there had been amusement at my expense, I now saw respect, and perhaps a touch of awe. Captain Harrison stepped back and saluted once more. "The Admiral's final message, sir. Jefferson High School is fortunate to have you as a student, and anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to discuss the matter with the United States Pacific Fleet." The 12 uniformed personnel executed a perfect about-face and began marching toward the cafeteria exit with the same precision they had displayed upon arrival. As they reached the doors, Captain Harrison paused and turned back toward our table. "Oh, and Mr. Morrison?" he called across the now silent room. Blake looked up with the expression of someone expecting a final blow. "You might want to reconsider your definition of strength. In my experience, the toughest warriors are often those who have already proven they can overcome what others consider impossible odds." With that, the military delegation disappeared through the cafeteria doors, leaving behind a room full of stunned teenagers and one thoroughly transformed social dynamic. The aftermath of Captain Harrison's departure left the cafeteria in a state of suspended animation. Students remained frozen in their seats, as if moving might somehow break the spell of what they had just witnessed. I sat clutching the wooden box containing my grandfather's insignia, the weight of it somehow anchoring me to reality in a moment. That felt completely surreal. Blake Morrison and his crew had melted away like snow in spring sunshine, their table now conspicuously empty. The quarterback who had seemed so formidable 20 minutes earlier had practically sprinted from the room, his face burning with embarrassment that would likely follow him for the remainder of his senior year. Slowly, conversation began to resume around the cafeteria, but the tone had fundamentally shifted. Instead of the casual chatter that typically filled lunch periods, I could hear whispered discussions about what had just occurred. Students kept glancing in my direction, but the looks were no longer mocking or pitying. They carried something closer to curiosity and respect. A girl with auburn hair approached my table hesitantly, her lunch tray balanced in her hands. "Excuse me?" she said quietly. "Would it be okay if I sat here? I'm Emma Chen, by the way. I'm in your chemistry class." I recognized her now. She'd been seated 2 rows behind me during first period, though we hadn't spoken. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the empty chairs around my table. Emma settled into her seat and opened her sandwich. "That was incredible," she said after a moment. "I've never seen anything like that in my entire life. Blake Morrison getting dressed down by actual military officers. It's going to be talked about for years." Before I could respond, 2 more students approached. The first was a tall, lanky guy with curly, dark hair and paint stains on his fingers. "Mind if we join you?" he asked. "I'm David Torres, and this is my friend Alex Kim. We were sitting over there watching the whole thing go down." Alex, a petite Asian girl with glasses and a NASA t-shirt, pulled out a chair. "Your aunt sounds amazing," she said earnestly. "An Admiral in the Pacific Fleet? That's seriously impressive. And those officers treating you with that kind of respect." Blake looked like he was going to pass out. As more students began filtering over to my table, I found myself in the unexpected position of being the center of positive attention. They wanted to know about my aunt, about my grandfather's service record, and about the letter Admiral Wheeler had sent. For the first time since starting at Jefferson High, I felt like I was being seen as a person rather than defined solely by my disability. Jessica Martinez, a senior I recognized from the drama club, leaned forward with genuine interest. "So your grandfather served in World War II? That's amazing family history. My great-grandfather fought in the Pacific too, but we don't know much about his service. He never talked about it." "I didn't know much about it either until today," I admitted, carefully opening the wooden box again to look at the insignia. "My family never really discussed the details." I guess Aunt Becca thought it was time I learned more about where I came from. The conversation flowed naturally from there, covering topics that had nothing to do with my crutches or medical condition. David shared stories about his artwork, Alex discussed her plans to study astrophysics, and Jessica talked about the upcoming school production of Our Town. For the first time in months, I felt like a normal teenager engaging in normal teenage conversations, but the real test came during my next class period. I arrived at Advanced Placement History to find the classroom buzzing with animated discussion. Mrs. Goldman, a veteran teacher known for her no-nonsense approach to education, called for order as students settled into their seats. "I understand we had some excitement during lunch today," she said, her knowing smile suggesting that news of the military visit had spread through the faculty as quickly as it had through the student body. "However, we have important material to cover regarding the Marshall Plan, so let's redirect our focus to post-war European reconstruction." As the lesson progressed, I noticed something different in the classroom dynamic. When Mrs. Goldman asked questions, several students actually looked to me expectantly, as if my family's military background might provide unique insights into historical events. The attention felt strange but not unwelcome. It was based on perceived knowledge and experience rather than curiosity about my disability. After class, a surprising figure approached my desk. Tyler Washington, one of Blake Morrison's usual followers, lingered as other students filed out. "Hey, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying none of the mockery that had characterized the morning's encounter. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. That whole thing with Blake, it wasn't cool. I should have said something." I looked up at Tyler, trying to read his expression. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he waited for my response. "Thanks," I said simply. "I appreciate that." Tyler nodded, then hesitated as if deciding whether to say more. "My older brother's in the army," he finally added. "He's deployed in Germany right now," when those officers were talking about courage and service. It made me think about him, about what that stuff really means. The admission revealed a depth I hadn't expected from someone I'd written off as just another jock following Blake's lead. It reminded me that people were more complicated than their surface appearances suggested, a lesson I should have learned from my own experiences being judged by my mobility aids. "What's his MOS?" I asked, using the military terminology for job specialty that I'd picked up from conversations with Aunt Becca years ago. Tyler's face brightened with surprise. "He's a combat engineer, building bridges, clearing obstacles, that kind of thing. You know military stuff?" "My aunt taught me some basics when I was younger," I explained. "She always said that understanding military structure and terminology was part of respecting the service." We talked for several more minutes about Tyler's brother and his deployment experiences. As our conversation wound down, Tyler extended his hand for a handshake, a gesture of respect I hadn't expected from someone who'd been laughing at my crutches just hours earlier. The transformation in social dynamics continued throughout the afternoon. In calculus class, I found myself included in a study group that was planning to meet after school. During English literature, when we discussed themes of heroism in classic novels, several classmates referenced the military visit and asked for my thoughts on how family legacy influences personal identity. Most surprisingly, Amanda Foster, one of the most popular girls in our grade, approached me at my locker between classes. "Marcus, right?" she said, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "I wanted to tell you how impressed I was by how you handled yourself today. Blake can be such a jerk sometimes, and you didn't let him get to you at all." "Thanks, Amanda," I replied, genuinely surprised by her attention. "I was wondering," she continued, "are you planning to go to the homecoming dance next month? A group of us are going together, and you'd be welcome to join if you're interested." The invitation caught me completely off guard. 3 days ago, I'd been invisible to students like Amanda Foster. Now she was inviting me to one of the school's major social events. I hadn't really thought about it, I admitted. Well, think about it, she said with a smile. It might be fun. As she walked away, I realized that the military visit had accomplished something far beyond humbling Blake Morrison. It had fundamentally altered how my classmates perceived me, shifting the narrative from disabled kid with crutches to student with distinguished military family who handles adversity with grace. But the biggest change wasn't in how others saw me. It was in how I was beginning to see myself. That evening, I sat in my bedroom reading Aunt Becca's letter for the 4th time. Her words about navigating storms with skill and determination resonated differently now that I'd experienced firsthand how quickly social dynamics could shift. I picked up my phone and dialed the number she'd included at the bottom of the letter. After several rings and a series of transfers, I heard her familiar voice. "Marcus, I was hoping you'd call. I heard from Captain Harrison that the visit went well." "Aunt Becca," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I don't know how you knew, but thank you." "Family looks out for family," she replied simply. "Besides, it's time you understood that being a Wheeler means something. We don't back down from challenges, and we don't let bullies define who we are." As we talked late into the evening, I began to understand that the day's events were just the beginning of a much larger transformation. One that would reshape not only how others saw me, but how I saw myself and my place in the world. 3. Weeks after the military visit, Jefferson High felt like a completely different school. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but rather through a series of small moments that gradually reshaped my entire high school experience. Blake Morrison had returned to classes the following Monday, but his demeanor had changed dramatically. Gone was the swaggering confidence that had made him the undisputed king of Jefferson's social hierarchy. He kept his head down in the hallways, avoided eye contact, and seemed to have developed a sudden interest in his textbooks during lunch. Periods. His former followers had quietly distanced themselves, leaving him to navigate the remainder of senior year as just another student, rather than the intimidating presence he'd once been. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was experiencing social mobility in an upward direction, Blake was discovering what it felt like to be ignored and marginalized, though without the additional challenge of a physical disability. My friendship with Emma Chen had deepened considerably. She turned out to be not only brilliant in chemistry, but also surprisingly funny, with a dry wit that made even our most boring classes entertaining. During our study sessions at the library, she'd casually mentioned that her older sister was studying at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. "I showed her the photos from that day in the cafeteria," Emma said one afternoon as we worked through calculus problems. "She was incredibly impressed by the whole thing. She said that kind of coordinated response from senior officers doesn't happen unless someone really high up the chain of command specifically requests it." "What do you mean?" I asked, looking up from my worksheet. "She thinks your aunt must have called in some serious favors to arrange that demonstration. 12 uniformed personnel from different branches showing up at a high school? That's not standard protocol for handling teenage bullies." The realization that Aunt Becca had gone to extraordinary lengths to support me added another layer of meaning to that day's events. It also reinforced something I was slowly beginning to understand about family loyalty and the lengths people would go to protect those they cared about. David Torres had become another unexpected friend. His artistic perspective brought a unique dimension to our growing group, and he'd started sketching portraits of various students during lunch periods. When he showed me the drawing he'd made of the military formation in the cafeteria, I was struck by how he'd captured not just the visual details but the emotional weight of the moment. "You should frame this," I told him, studying the precise lines and shading that brought the scene to life on paper. "Actually, I was thinking of submitting it to the school art show," David replied. "But only if you're okay with that. It's your story, after all." The idea of my experience being transformed into art felt surreal. but I gave him permission. When the piece was displayed in the main hallway 2 weeks later, it drew crowds of students who stopped to examine David's interpretation of that pivotal moment. My academic performance had improved as well, though not because the subjects had become easier. Instead, I found myself more engaged in class discussions, more willing to volunteer answers, and more confident about participating in group projects. The change in my social status had created a positive feedback loop that affected every aspect of my school experience. Mrs. Goldman had asked me to research my grandfather's military service for a presentation about World War II veterans. What I discovered during my research exceeded anything I could have imagined. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Wheeler hadn't just served in the Pacific Theater. He'd been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His destroyer had rescued survivors from a damaged aircraft carrier while under enemy fire, and my grandfather had personally led the rescue operations that saved 37 sailors from drowning. When I presented these findings to the class, the response was electric. Students who had never shown interest in military history suddenly had dozens of questions about naval warfare, medal citations, and the challenges faced by greatest generation veterans. "Your grandfather sounds like a real hero," Jessica Martinez commented after my presentation. "I'm starting to think heroism might be a family trait," replied Alex Kim, earning nods of agreement from several classmates. But the most significant development came when Principal Stevens called me into his office during fourth period on a Thursday morning. Margaret Stevens was a formidable woman in her mid-50s who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Her office walls displayed degrees from prestigious universities alongside photographs of her shaking hands with various educational leaders and politicians. "Sit down, Marcus," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to discuss something important with you." My mind immediately raced through potential problems. Had someone complained about the military visit? Was there an issue with my academic accommodations? "I've been following your progress since you enrolled at Jefferson," Principal Stevens continued, "and I've been particularly impressed by how you've handled some challenging social situations." She paused to shuffle through some papers on her desk, finally selecting a thick folder. "I've also been in communication with your aunt, Admiral Wheeler, regarding your academic future. She mentioned that you're considering various college options, but haven't yet decided on a specific path." This was news to me. While Aunt Becca and I had spoken several times since the cafeteria incident, we hadn't discussed my college plans in detail. "The Admiral has extended an invitation for you to spend your spring break at Pearl Harbor," Principal Stevens continued. "She believes exposure to military operations and naval history might help clarify your interests and goals." The offer was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Visiting Pearl Harbor had always been a dream of mine, but the prospect of spending a week in a military environment felt overwhelming. "There's more," Principal Stevens added. "She's also arranged for you to interview with the admissions board at the Naval Academy during your visit. Apparently, your academic record and family military history make you a strong candidate for appointment." The Naval Academy. I had never seriously considered military service as a career path, partly because of concerns about how my physical limitations might affect my eligibility. But Aunt Becca seemed to believe otherwise. "I know this is a lot to process," Principal Stevens said gently, "but I wanted you to understand that you have options beyond traditional civilian universities. Your response to adversity and your leadership potential haven't gone unnoticed." Leadership potential. The phrase surprised me. I'd never thought of myself as a leader, but reflecting on recent weeks, I realized that other students had indeed begun looking to me for guidance in various situations. When I returned to lunch that day, I found my usual table surrounded by a larger group than normal. Word had apparently spread about my research presentation, and several students wanted to hear more details about my grandfather's war service. "So he actually saved 37 people?" asked Connor Phillips, a sophomore who rarely spoke to upperclassmen, "while being shot at by enemy planes." added Maria Santos, shaking her head in amazement. As I recounted the details I'd learned from military archives, I noticed that Blake Morrison was sitting alone at a distant table, occasionally glancing in our direction. The reversal of our positions was so complete that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Tyler Washington appeared at my shoulder carrying his lunch tray. "Mind if I join you guys? I just got off the phone with my brother in Germany, and he wanted me to tell you something." The table fell quiet as Tyler settled into his seat. He said that when word got around his unit about what happened here, apparently military gossip travels fast, his commanding officer made a point of telling everyone about your grandfather's Silver Star citation. Your family name carries weight in military circles. The revelation added yet another dimension to my growing understanding of family legacy and the responsibilities that came with it. I was beginning to realize that being a Wheeler meant more than just sharing DNA with distinguished service members. It meant upholding standards of conduct and character that had been established by previous generations. As lunch period ended, and students began clearing their tables, Amanda Foster approached with an unusual request. "Marcus, I was wondering if you'd be interested in running for senior class vice president. Nominations are due next week. And honestly, after everything that's happened, I think you'd be perfect for the position." Student government had never been on my radar, but the suggestion made sense in ways I was only beginning to understand. The events of recent weeks had demonstrated that I could handle pressure, command respect, and represent something larger than myself. "Think about it," Amanda added as she gathered her belongings. "The school could use someone who understands what real leadership looks like." That afternoon, as I made my way through hallways filled with students who now greeted me by name, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that first day in the cafeteria. The crutches that had once marked me as different now seemed incidental to how people saw me. But the real transformation wasn't in their perception. It was in my own growing understanding of who I was and what I might become. The decision to run for senior class vice president consumed my thoughts for the next week. Student government at Jefferson High carried real responsibility. The officers worked directly with administration on policy decisions, budget allocations for activities, and representing student interests in district-wide meetings. It wasn't just a popularity contest or resume padding for college applications. Emma had been incredibly supportive when I mentioned Amanda's suggestion. "You absolutely should do it," she said during our Wednesday study session. "After everything that's happened, you'd bring a completely different perspective to student leadership. Plus, you've already proven you can handle pressure situations with grace." David nodded enthusiastically while sketching in his notebook. "Margins. The whole school saw how you dealt with Blake's harassment. That kind of composure under fire would be valuable in student government." But it was Alex Kim who raised the practical concerns that had been nagging at me. "Have you thought about the campaign requirements? You'll need to give speeches, attend events, possibly debate other candidates. Are you comfortable with that level of public exposure?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. While my social status had improved dramatically, the idea of standing before the entire student body still felt daunting. My crutches would be visible to everyone, and there would inevitably be students who still saw my disability as a limitation rather than understanding it as part of my story. I discussed these concerns with my parents that evening over dinner. My father, who had been quietly proud of my recent transformation but careful not to interfere, offered unexpected wisdom. "Marcus, your Aunt Becca called me yesterday," he said, setting down his fork. "She told me about the Naval Academy opportunity, and she also mentioned that leadership often chooses us rather than the other way around." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means that sometimes we find ourselves in positions where others need us to step forward regardless of whether we feel ready. Your classmates aren't suggesting you run because they pity you or want to make some statement about inclusion. They're suggesting it because they've seen qualities in you that you might not even recognize in yourself." My mother, who had been my strongest advocate throughout all my medical challenges, added her perspective. I've watched you grow so much this semester. The confidence you've gained, the way you've handled difficult situations. These are leadership qualities that can't be taught. They come from experience and character. That night, I called Aunt Becca to discuss both the student government opportunity and the Pearl Harbor visit she'd arranged. Her response was characteristically direct. Leadership isn't about being the loudest person in the room or having all the answers, she said. It's about listening carefully, making thoughtful decisions, and having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. You've already demonstrated all of those qualities. But what if I lose? I asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking beneath all my other concerns. Aunt Becca laughed, a sound that carried both affection and slight exasperation. Marcus, winning or losing an election is beside the point. The important thing is being willing to serve when called upon. Besides, I have a feeling you'd be surprised by the level of support you have. Her confidence was reassuring, but I still needed to make the decision for myself. The following morning, I arrived at school to find an unexpected scene unfolding near the main entrance. Blake Morrison stood surrounded by 3 younger students, who appeared to be freshmen. His body language was aggressive, and I could hear raised voices even from a distance. As I approached, the situation became clearer. The freshmen were students I recognized from the special education program, kids with various learning disabilities and developmental challenges who often became targets for harassment. Blake was blocking their path to the building, apparently, having reverted to his old patterns of behavior now that his former social status had crumbled. "Come on, slowpokes," Blake was saying with the cruel smile I remembered from our cafeteria encounter. "Don't you know school starts at 8? Maybe you need to get here earlier if you can't move fast enough." The 3 freshmen looked uncomfortable and frightened. One of them, a small boy with thick glasses, was clutching his backpack straps and staring at the ground. I felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was accompanied by something new, a sense of responsibility to act. The old Marcus might have walked past, telling himself it wasn't his business, and that confronting Blake would only create more problems. But the events of recent weeks had changed something fundamental in my perspective. I approached the group with deliberate steps, my crutches clicking against the concrete with the same rhythm that had once announced my vulnerability, but now carried a different meaning entirely. "Blake!" I called out, my voice carrying enough authority to make him turn around. His expression shifted immediately upon seeing me. The cruel confidence faltered, replaced by the same uncertainty I'd seen in the cafeteria 3 weeks earlier. "Marcus," he said, attempting to sound casual. "Just talking to my friends here about time management." "No, you weren't," I replied evenly, stopping close enough to make my presence felt, but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. "You were bullying these students because you think they're easy targets." The 3 freshmen looked up at me, with expressions of surprise and hope. I recognized one of them from the hallways, Jamie Rodriguez, a kid with autism who often ate lunch alone in the library. "I think you should apologize," I continued, maintaining eye contact with Blake. "Apologize?" Blake's voice cracked slightly. "For what? I wasn't doing anything wrong." "You were doing exactly what you did to me in the cafeteria," I said. "Picking on people you perceived as different, hoping to make yourself feel better by making them feel worse. The only difference is that now you're targeting freshmen who can't defend themselves as easily." The small crowd of students who had been walking to their first period classes had begun to gather around us, drawn by the confrontation. I could see phones being pulled out, just as they had been during my encounter with Blake in the cafeteria. But this time, I wasn't the victim being recorded. I was the one taking a stand. "You know what the real difference is between you and these students, Blake?" I asked, gesturing toward the 3 freshmen. "They're here to learn and grow and become better versions of themselves. You're here to tear other people down because you can't figure out how to build yourself up." Blake's face flushed red, but for once he seemed at a loss for words. The students around us were completely silent, watching the drama unfold with the same intensity they might reserve for a particularly gripping movie. These students, I continued, turning to address Jamie and his friends directly, have more courage in their little fingers than you've shown in your entire high school career. They face challenges every day that you can't even imagine, and they keep showing up, keep trying, keep pushing forward despite obstacles that would make most people quit. Jamie Rodriguez looked up at me with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone was defending him in such a public way. His two companions stood a little straighter, their earlier fear beginning to transform into something resembling pride. Now, I said, turning back to Blake, are you going to apologize to these students, or do I need to have another conversation with Captain Harrison about respect and dignity? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Everyone present remembered the military visit and its aftermath. Blake's eyes widened at the mention of the Navy captain who had so thoroughly humiliated him in front of the entire school. I'm sorry, Blake mumbled, looking down at his shoes. Say it properly, I insisted. Look at them when you apologize. Blake raised his head reluctantly and made eye contact with each of the freshmen. I'm sorry for blocking your way and for saying those things. It wasn't right. Thank you, I said simply. Now I think it's time for all of us to get to class, as the crowd began to disperse. Jamie Rodriguez approached me hesitantly. Thank you, Marcus, he said quietly. Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, I replied. If anyone bothers you again, let me know. We look out for each other here. The interaction had lasted less than 10 minutes, but its impact rippled through the school for the rest of the day. By lunchtime, the story had spread to every corner of Jefferson High, each retelling adding new details and emphasizing different aspects of the confrontation. When I sat down at my usual table, I found it surrounded by an even larger group than normal. Emma was beaming with pride, David was already sketching the scene from memory, and Alex was shaking her head in amazement. That was incredible, Emma said. The way you handled that situation, you sounded like a real leader. You basically just ran your campaign for vice president without even knowing it, added Tyler Washington, who had witnessed the encounter from across the courtyard. Amanda Foster appeared at my shoulder with a nomination form in her hand. Please tell me you're ready to make this official, she said, holding out the paperwork. After this morning, I think you'd win by the biggest landslide in school history. I looked around the table at the faces of students who had become not just friends but supporters and allies. In their expressions, I saw something that had been missing from my life for years. Genuine respect earned through actions rather than granted out of pity or obligation. I took the nomination form from Amanda's hand and signed my name at the bottom. Let's do this, I said. The week leading up to the student government elections transformed Jefferson High into a buzzing hive of political activity. Campaign posters lined the hallways, candidates delivered speeches during lunch periods, and the entire senior class seemed energized by the competitive atmosphere. My opponent for vice president was Sarah Mitchell, a respected member of the debate team with an impressive academic record and strong connections throughout the school's various clubs and organizations. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have been considered the obvious choice. She had served on student council for 3 years, maintained a perfect GPA, and possessed the kind of polished public speaking skills that made her a formidable candidate. But these weren't normal circumstances, and my campaign had momentum that surprised even me. David Torres had designed campaign posters that were works of art in themselves. Rather than typical political slogans, they featured powerful imagery inspired by military service and community leadership. One poster showed a silhouette figure with crutches standing beside American flag imagery, with the simple message, "Leadership through adversity, Marcus Wheeler for vice president." Emma Chen had organized a volunteer team that seemed to appear everywhere on campus. Students I'd never spoken to were wearing Wheeler for VP buttons and distributing flyers between classes. The grassroots support felt organic and genuine in ways that traditional student campaigns rarely achieved. But the most powerful moment of the campaign came during the mandatory candidate speeches held in the gymnasium 3 days before voting. The entire senior class packed into the bleachers, with faculty members lining the walls and several parents scattered throughout the audience. Principal Stevens introduced each candidate with brief biographical information, and we drew lots to determine speaking order. I would go last, following Sarah's presentation. Sarah delivered exactly the kind of speech I'd expected: polished, professional, and filled with specific policy proposals about improving cafeteria options, expanding parking facilities, and organizing more social events. Her presentation was competent and well-rehearsed, earning respectful applause from the audience. When my turn came, I approached the podium with my crutches clicking against the gymnasium floor in the silence that had fallen over the assembled students. For a moment I stood looking out at hundreds of faces, some expectant, others curious, a few skeptical. I had prepared extensive notes, but standing there in front of my peers, I realized that what I needed to say couldn't be read from index cards. 3 months ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium's sound system. I walked into Jefferson High as a transfer student who just wanted to make it through senior year without causing problems or drawing attention to myself. I figured if I kept my head down and stayed invisible, I could graduate quietly and move on to whatever came next. I paused, scanning the audience and noting how many faces I now recognized as friends and allies. But sometimes life has different plans. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations that force us to choose between staying invisible and standing up for what's right. Sometimes we discover that the things that make us different aren't weaknesses to hide, but strengths to embrace. In the front row, I could see Emma nodding encouragingly. David had his sketchbook out, capturing the moment from his unique artistic perspective. Tyler Washington gave me a thumbs up from the sophomore section. I'm not running for vice president because I want to add another line to my college applications or because I think it would be cool to have a title. I'm running because I've learned that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or having all the answers. It's about listening to people who feel unheard, standing up for students who can't stand up for themselves, and creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their differences, can succeed. The gymnasium had grown completely quiet. Even the faculty members along the walls had stopped their whispered conversations to focus on my words. Some of you know that my family has a tradition of military service. My grandfather earned the Silver Star in World War II. My aunt is an admiral in the Pacific Fleet. They taught me that true strength comes not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head-on with dignity and determination. I shifted my weight on my crutches, a movement that once would have made me self-conscious but now felt natural and unimportant. Every day, I see students at Jefferson who are fighting battles that most people don't recognize or understand. Kids, dealing with learning disabilities, family problems, financial struggles, social anxiety, physical challenges, and dozens of other obstacles that make just getting through a school day feel like a major victory. I could see heads nodding throughout the audience, students recognizing themselves or their friends in my description. These students don't need pity or special treatment. They need what we all need: respect, understanding, and the knowledge that their voices matter. They need to know that their school government represents them too, not just the students who fit traditional definitions of success. My voice grew stronger as I reached the core of my message. If you elect me as your vice president, I promise to be an advocate for every student who has ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside. I promise to bring the same determination that gets me out of bed every morning despite physical challenges to addressing the challenges facing our entire student body. I looked directly at the section where Blake Morrison sat with his remaining friends. His expression was unreadable, but he was listening intently. I also promised to work with anyone, regardless of past conflicts or differences of opinion. who is genuinely committed to making Jefferson High a better place for everyone. Because that's what real leadership looks like, building bridges, not walls. The gymnasium erupted in applause that was louder and more sustained than anything Sarah had received. Students were on their feet, whistling and cheering with an enthusiasm that surprised even me. Faculty members were clapping, and I could see Principal Stevens nodding approvingly from her position near the stage. As the noise died down, I delivered my closing statement. In 2 days, you'll have a choice to make. You can elect someone who represents the traditional path of student leadership, or you can choose someone who represents the possibility that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. Either way, thank you for listening, and thank you for making Jefferson High the kind of place where a kid with crutches can stand up here and believe he has something valuable to contribute. The second round of applause was even louder than the first. Students were chanting my name, and I could see tears in some faces, including Emma's, as I made my way back to my seat. Election day arrived with unprecedented voter turnout. Lines stretched down hallways as students waited to cast their ballots, and the energy throughout the school felt electric. When the results were announced during final period, the margin of victory exceeded everyone's expectations. I had won with 73% of the vote. But the real victory came later that afternoon when Blake Morrison approached me at my locker. "Congratulations," he said simply, extending his hand for a handshake. I studied his expression, looking for traces of the sarcasm or mockery that had characterized our previous interactions. Instead, I found something I hadn't expected: genuine respect. "Thank you," I replied, accepting his handshake. "I wanted to apologize," Blake continued, "for everything that happened earlier this year. The way I treated you, it wasn't right, and I knew it wasn't right even when I was doing it." "Why did you do it then?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Blake looked uncomfortable, but he answered honestly. "Because I was scared. I was afraid that if I wasn't constantly proving how tough and popular I was, people would see that I was just as insecure and uncertain as everyone else. Picking on you made me feel powerful, which was stupid and cruel." The admission revealed more vulnerability than I'd thought Blake Morrison possessed. "I respect what you said in your speech about working with anyone who wants to make things better," he continued. "If you meant that, I'd like to help however I can." 3 months later, I found myself standing on the deck of the USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor, looking out over the harbor where my grandfather had served with such distinction. Aunt Becca stood beside me, her Admiral's uniform crisp in the Hawaiian sunshine. "So," she said, "have you decided about the Naval Academy?" I considered the question that had been dominating my thoughts throughout the spring break visit. The past week had been extraordinary, touring naval facilities, meeting officers from around the Pacific Fleet, and experiencing firsthand the dedication and professionalism of military service. "I think so," I replied. "But not for the reasons you might expect." Aunt Becca raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to explain. "I used to think that my disability disqualified me from certain paths in life. But this year taught me that limitations exist mostly in our own minds. Whether I serve in the Navy or work in civilian leadership, the important thing is using whatever platform I have to advocate for people who need someone in their corner." Aunt Becca smiled, the expression transforming her usually serious face. "That sounds exactly like something a Wheeler would say." As we stood there watching the sunset over Pearl Harbor, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a frightened transfer student hoping to survive high school unnoticed. Now I was student, government vice president, Naval Academy candidate, and something I'd never imagined possible: a leader others looked to for guidance and inspiration. The crutches that had once marked me as different now felt like symbols of the strength that comes from overcoming adversity. They reminded me daily that real power isn't about physical perfection or social status. It's about having the courage to stand up when standing up is difficult, and the wisdom to use that courage in service of others. Jefferson High had given me far more than an education. It had given me the opportunity to discover who I really was, and more importantly, who I could become. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.